The early morning fog hung thick over Route 27, a quiet stretch of highway just outside of Pine Grove. Mike Chen, a 32-year-old construction worker, was driving home after finishing his night shift. His weathered pickup truck rumbled steadily as classic rock played softly on the radio. It was the kind of morning where most people would be brewing their first cup of coffee, but Mike's day was winding down. The peaceful drive was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and a loud crash up ahead. Through the fog, Mike spotted the flickering of what looked like flames. His heart racing, he pulled over to the shoulder and jumped out of his truck, his work boots hitting the asphalt with purpose. As he ran toward the scene, the fog parted to reveal a police cruiser wrapped around a tree. Flames were already licking up from under the hood, and black smoke billowed into the gray morning sky. Mike's construction worker instincts kicked in. He'd seen enough workplace accidents to know that every second counted. He reached the cruiser and found the driver's side door was crushed. Through the window, he could see the unconscious officer slumped over the steering wheel, still strapped in by his seatbelt. The heat from the growing flames was intense, and Mike could hear the ominous crackling of the fire spreading. Without hesitation, Mike tried the passenger door. It was locked. The window was already hot to the touch. He looked around frantically and spotted a piece of broken guardrail nearby. Grabbing it, he smashed the passenger window, glass shattering around him. The smoke was getting thicker now, making it hard to breathe. Mike climbed halfway into the cruiser, his arms burning from the heat. He reached across to unbuckle the officer's seatbelt, but it was jammed. The flames were getting closer, and he could hear the metal of the car groaning under the heat. Sweat poured down his face as he pulled out his pocket knife, the one he always carried for work, and sawed through the seatbelt. The unconscious officer was heavy, dead weight in Mike's arms as he pulled him across the center console. Every muscle in Mike's body screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept him going. He could feel the heat becoming unbearable, the flames now reaching the dashboard. Just as Mike managed to drag the officer out through the passenger side, the car's gas tank exploded. The force knocked them both to the ground several feet away. Mike covered the officer's body with his own as debris rained down around them. His ears were ringing, and his lungs burned from the smoke, but they were alive. Other drivers had stopped by now, and someone was calling 911. Mike checked the officer's pulse. It was there, steady but weak. As he waited for help to arrive, he noticed the officer's badge, Officer David Park. The name would become significant in ways Mike couldn't yet imagine. As sirens wailed in the distance, Mike sat on the cold ground, his work clothes covered in soot and glass. His hands were shaking, and his skin stung from various cuts and burns. But as he watched the officer's chest rise and fall with each breath, he knew he'd done what anyone would have done in his position. What Mike didn't know was that this morning would change not just Officer Park's life, but his own in ways he never could have predicted. The story of his bravery would spread far beyond their small town, touching lives across the country. But for now, as emergency vehicles approached through the lifting fog, Mike was just grateful they were both alive. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test his courage, challenge his beliefs, and ultimately reveal the extraordinary impact that one ordinary person's split-second decision could have on countless lives. As dawn broke over Route 27, the first chapter of an incredible story was just beginning to unfold. The next 48 hours passed in a blur for Mike. After the ambulance took Officer Park away, Mike had given his statement to the police, declined a trip to the hospital despite his minor burns, and headed home to finally get some sleep. He'd called in sick to work, something he rarely did in his 15 years on the job. His body ached, and his hands were bandaged from the cuts and burns, but his mind kept replaying the rescue over and over. He didn't expect what happened next. By noon, his phone was buzzing constantly. Someone had captured the entire rescue on their phone, and the video was spreading like wildfire across social media. Local news vans parked outside his modest apartment complex, and reporters were calling non-stop. Mike, who had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I'm no hero," he kept telling reporters who managed to catch him. "Anyone would have done the same thing." But the public didn't see it that way. In a time when negative news dominated headlines, Mike's act of courage had struck a chord with people across the country. Meanwhile, at Central Valley Hospital, Officer Park lay in the ICU, surrounded by fellow officers and family. He had suffered a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and smoke inhalation, but doctors were optimistic about his recovery. His wife, Annie, a kindergarten teacher, hadn't left his side since the accident. When she heard about Mike's reluctance to visit the hospital, she reached out through the police department. "Please tell him David's asking for him," she said. "We owe him everything." 3 days after the rescue, Mike finally gathered the courage to visit the hospital. Walking through the corridors in his cleanest work jacket, carrying a simple get-well card, he felt out of place among the doctors and nurses rushing past. When he reached Officer Park's room, he found not just the injured officer and his wife, but also the entire Park family, parents, siblings, and even their 2 young children. What happened next caught Mike completely off guard. As he entered the room, everyone fell silent. Then, Officer Park's elderly father stepped forward, tears in his eyes, and embraced Mike in a tight hug. "You saved my son," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You saved our whole family." The meeting lasted for hours. Mike learned that David Park was a second-generation police officer, following in his father's footsteps. His kids, 6-year-old Jenny and 8-year-old Tommy, looked at Mike with awe, as if he were a superhero from their comic books. Annie showed Mike photos of their family, sharing stories, and making him feel like he'd known them for years. But it wasn't just the Park family who wanted to show their gratitude. The police department had organized a ceremony to honor Mike's bravery, despite his protests. The mayor wanted to give him a key to the city. Local businesses sent gifts and offers of free services. A crowdfunding campaign, started by Officer Park's precinct, had raised over $50,000 in just a few days to help with any medical expenses Mike might have and to recognize his heroism. The attention made Mike uncomfortable. He was just a construction worker who did what needed to be done. But as he sat in that hospital room, watching Officer Park hold his children's hands and seeing the love and relief in Annie's eyes, something began to shift in his perspective. Officer Park, still weak but improving, grabbed Mike's hand. "You know what I thought about when I woke up here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not the accident. Not the pain. I thought about my kids growing up without a father. My wife facing life alone. You didn't just save my life, Mike. You saved my family's future." The words hit Mike hard. He thought about his own life, the long hours at construction sites, the quiet apartment he returned to each night, the dreams he'd put on hold. He'd always told himself he was content with his simple life, but something about this experience was awakening long-buried aspirations. As Mike left the hospital that evening, a local news crew was waiting outside. This time, instead of avoiding them, he stopped. The reporter asked him what it felt like to be called a hero. "I'm learning that sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest decisions," Mike said thoughtfully. "I didn't think about being a hero that morning. I just knew I couldn't drive past someone who needed help. But now, seeing the Park family, understanding what my actions meant to them, it's made me realize we all have the power to make a difference in someone's life." What Mike didn't say was how this experience was already changing him. The construction worker who had always played it safe was starting to see life differently. The gratitude of the Park family, the community's response, and the renewed sense of purpose he felt were awakening something in him, a desire to do more, to be more. As he drove home that night, past the spot where the accident had occurred, Mike realized that while he had saved Officer Park's life that foggy morning, in many ways, Officer Park and his family were saving his. The real story was just beginning to unfold, and the changes coming to Mike's life would be more profound than anyone could have imagined. 2 weeks after the rescue, Mike's life had taken unexpected turns. The viral video of his heroic act had reached millions of views, and national news networks were calling for interviews. But it was a quiet conversation with Officer Park that would set in motion the most significant change in Mike's life. During one of his regular hospital visits, Mike mentioned his background before construction work. Few people knew that he'd studied emergency medical services for a year in community college before financial struggles forced him to drop out. He'd always carried a regret about not finishing, but bills needed to be paid, and construction work was steady. "Why didn't you go back?" Officer Park asked from his hospital bed, now sitting up and looking stronger each day. When Mike shrugged and mumbled something about timing and money, Annie Park, who was grading papers in the corner, looked up with sudden interest. "You know," she said, setting aside her students' work, "the department has a scholarship program for people interested in emergency services. After what you did, I'm sure they'd consider your application." Mike brushed off the suggestion at first, but the seed had been planted. That night, as he sat in his apartment looking at old photos from his college days, he found himself opening his laptop and searching for EMT certification programs. The next morning, he received an unexpected call from the police chief. The department wanted to do more than just honor him with a ceremony. They wanted to offer him a full scholarship to complete his EMT training. The video of his rescue had inspired a local business owner to donate to the department's community education fund, specifically requesting that Mike be the first recipient. "Sometimes the universe has a way of pointing us in the right direction," the chief said. "You've got natural instincts and a good heart. We need more people like you in emergency services." Mike sat in his truck for a long time after that call, staring at the construction site where he'd worked for the past decade. His co-workers had been supportive, even organizing a collection to help with his minor medical bills from the burns. But as he watched them move around the site, he realized he was ready for a change. The decision wasn't easy. EMT training would mean cutting back his work hours, living on savings, and stepping way outside his comfort zone. But every time he visited Officer Park and saw the progress in his recovery, every time little Jenny showed him her latest drawing of her hero friend, he felt more certain about his choice. Word spread quickly through the small town about Mike's decision to pursue EMT training. The local diner where he often grabbed breakfast started a "Support Mike" jar. His landlord, a retired firefighter, offered to reduce his rent during his training. The community that had witnessed his courage was now rallying to support his dreams. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Mike's first week of classes was humbling. At 32, he was older than most of his classmates, and the medical terminology felt like a foreign language. Late at night, after long hours of studying, doubt would creep in. Was he foolish to think he could start over at his age? During one particularly difficult week, he visited Officer Park, who had finally been discharged and was recovering at home. He found the officer in his backyard, slowly walking laps as part of his physical therapy. Mike confessed his struggles with the training program. "You know what I think about during these walks?" Officer Park said, pausing to catch his breath. "That morning in the car. I was unconscious, but the department psychologist says our brains still process things even then. I remember feeling heat, smoke, and then, safety. That was you, Mike. You didn't hesitate because you didn't know medical terms. You acted because your instincts and your heart told you to help." The conversation shifted something in Mike's perspective. He started seeing his age and life experience as advantages rather than obstacles. His construction background gave him a unique understanding of accident scenes and structural hazards. His years of physical labor meant he had the strength and stamina for the demanding work of an EMT. As weeks turned into months, Mike found himself thriving in his new path. The burn scars on his hands had faded, but they served as a daily reminder of the morning that had changed everything. He started helping other students in his class who struggled with practical scenarios, drawing from his real-life experience. The Park family remained a constant source of support. Sunday dinners at their house became a tradition, with Mike helping Tommy with his science homework while Jenny showed him her latest karate moves. Annie would pack him leftovers, knowing his study schedule left little time for cooking. Officer Park, now back on light duty at the station, became more than just someone he'd helped, he became a brother. One evening, as Mike left the Park's house, he noticed a familiar fog rolling in, reminiscent of that fateful morning. But instead of bringing back traumatic memories, it filled him with a sense of purpose. He was no longer just the construction worker who'd made a split-second decision to help, he was becoming the person he was always meant to be. What Mike didn't know was that his journey was inspiring others in ways he couldn't imagine. His story had sparked a movement in the community, reminding people that it's never too late to pursue your dreams, that sometimes life's most challenging moments can lead to its greatest opportunities, and that courage comes in many forms, not just in the act of saving a life, but in the decision to transform your own. 6 months into his EMT training, Mike faced his biggest test yet. It came not in the form of an exam or practical assessment, but through an unexpected encounter that would put everything he'd learned to the test. He was leaving the training center late one evening when he heard commotion in the parking lot. An elderly man had collapsed while walking to his car. Without thinking, Mike rushed over, his training kicking in automatically. He found the man conscious but struggling to breathe, showing signs of a possible heart attack. As other students called 911, Mike stayed with the man, keeping him calm and monitoring his vitals just as he'd been taught. His hands, once more comfortable gripping construction tools, now moved with precision as he carried out his assessment. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics praised his quick response and proper care. What Mike didn't know was that the man he helped was Dr. Robert Wong, a retired emergency room physician and current board member of the local hospital. A week later, Mike received a call that would open yet another door in his journey. "We need people like you," Dr. Wong told him during a meeting at the hospital. "Someone who combines technical skills with genuine compassion. Have you considered continuing your education beyond EMT certification? The hospital has a paramedic training program." The suggestion took Mike by surprise. He was still adjusting to his new path as an EMT student, and the thought of pushing further hadn't crossed his mind. But as Dr. Wong spoke about the advanced skills and greater responsibility of paramedics, Mike felt that familiar spark of possibility. That evening, he drove to Officer Park's house to share the news. He found David in much better shape, playing basketball with Tommy in the driveway. The sight of his friend, now fully recovered and active with his son, reminded Mike of why he'd started this journey. "You know what I think?" Officer Park said after hearing about Dr. Wong's suggestion. "That morning when you pulled me from the car, you were already a paramedic at heart. You just didn't have the title yet." The conversation was interrupted by Annie calling them in for dinner. Over lasagna, Mike shared his doubts about taking on an even bigger challenge. The Park family listened, but then Jenny, now 7, surprised everyone with her wisdom. "But Uncle Mike," she said, using the nickname she'd given him months ago, "you always tell me to be brave when I'm scared at karate tournaments. Isn't this the same thing?" Her words hit home. Mike realized that courage wasn't just about running toward burning cars, it was about running toward your future, even when the path seemed daunting. The next few weeks became a balancing act. Mike continued his EMT training while beginning the application process for the paramedic program. His construction calluses were gradually being replaced by the marks of his new profession, small nicks from practice with medical equipment, the permanent indent on his finger from holding a pen during endless notes. His classmates, who had initially seen him as the older guy with the viral video fame, now sought his help and advice. Mike's real-world experience and calm demeanor made him a natural leader in practical scenarios. The instructors noticed too, often using his insights to enhance their teachings. But it wasn't all success and progress. One particularly challenging day, Mike responded to his first real emergency as part of his practical training. A car accident, though nowhere near as severe as Officer Park's, brought back vivid memories of that foggy morning. For a moment, he froze, the smell of gasoline and burning rubber overwhelming his senses. It was his training partner, a young woman named Lily, who helped him through it. "Remember why you're here," she said quietly, and those simple words snapped him back to the present. They worked together seamlessly to stabilize the patient, and Mike learned another valuable lesson, that sometimes the rescuer needs support too. The incident led to a deep conversation with Officer Park during their weekly coffee meetup. David shared his own experiences with trauma and recovery, not just physical but emotional. Their bond grew stronger as they discovered this new common ground, two men learning to process the intense experiences their chosen professions brought. As spring turned to summer, Mike's transformation became evident to everyone around him. His vocabulary now included medical terminology that would have been foreign to him a year ago. His posture had changed, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing his purpose. Even his old construction crew noticed the difference when they met for their monthly pizza night. "You look like you finally found your place, Chen," his former foreman said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Always knew you were meant for something different." The scholarship money was tight, and Mike had to pick up weekend construction jobs to make ends meet. But every time he practiced taking vital signs, every time he mastered a new skill, he felt more certain that he was on the right path. What made everything worthwhile were the moments when theory became reality. During a training rotation in the emergency room, Mike helped stabilize a young accident victim, talking to her the whole time, keeping her calm just as he'd done with Officer Park. After she was safely in treatment, her mother hugged him, tears in her eyes. "You have a gift for this," the supervising nurse told him later. "Some people can learn the skills, but that connection with patients, that's something you can't teach." As Mike drove home that night, past the spot on Route 27 where everything had changed, he reflected on how far he'd come. The burned police cruiser had long since been cleared away, but the impact of that morning continued to ripple through his life in unexpected ways. What had started as a simple act of courage was becoming a legacy of transformation, not just for Mike, but for everyone his story touched. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that this was still just the beginning. The decision to enter paramedic training wasn't just about Mike anymore. As he sat in Dr. Wong's office signing the application papers, he realized how many people had invested in his journey. The morning that had started with a simple choice to help someone had created ripples that continued to spread in unexpected ways. Dr. Wong had become more than just a mentor, he was now championing a community initiative inspired by Mike's story. The hospital was launching a scholarship program for second-career medical professionals, aimed at people who, like Mike, had found their calling later in life. "Your story resonates with people," Dr. Wong explained, adjusting his glasses. "It shows that heroism isn't just about that one dramatic moment, it's about the courage to completely change your life's direction when you find your true purpose." But life had a way of testing that courage. Just as Mike was preparing to start his paramedic training, his mother called from Seattle with news that would shake his world. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage cancer and needed support during treatment. The timing couldn't have been worse, dropping everything now would mean delaying his training, possibly losing his scholarship. When he shared the news with the Park family during their Sunday dinner, the silence around the table was heavy. But it was Annie who spoke up first, her teacher's instincts kicking in with a practical solution. "You know," she said, passing the mashed potatoes, "Seattle has some of the best paramedic training programs in the country. Maybe this isn't an obstacle, maybe it's an opportunity." The next few weeks became a whirlwind of activity. Officer Park reached out to his contacts in the Seattle Police Department, who connected Mike with their Emergency Services Division. Dr. Wong made some calls to his colleagues at Harborview Medical Center. The local fire chief wrote a glowing recommendation letter. The construction crew he'd worked with for so many years organized a goodbye barbecue. His former foreman pulled him aside during the party. "Remember when you first started here?" he asked, pointing to the calluses on Mike's hands. "You were just looking for a job. Now you've found a calling. That's worth following, wherever it takes you." The hardest goodbye was to the Park family. Jenny and Tommy had prepared a scrapbook filled with photos and drawings from the past year. "Seattle's not that far," Tommy said bravely, though his trembling lip betrayed his emotions. "And you can teach us about the Space Needle during video calls." Officer Park drove Mike to the airport on a crisp autumn morning. As they unloaded his bags, David handed him an envelope. "Don't open it until you're on the plane," he said, pulling Mike into a tight hug. "And remember, you'll always have family here." On the plane, Mike opened the envelope to find a letter from the entire Park family, along with a photo of all of them together at Tommy's recent birthday party. The letter spoke of how one person's courage had changed not just a life, but an entire family's future. "You didn't just save David that morning," Annie had written. "You showed us all what it means to live with purpose." Seattle brought new challenges and opportunities. Mike moved into a small apartment near his mother's house, juggling his time between caring for her during her treatments and throwing himself into his paramedic studies. The program was even more demanding than he'd expected, but his experience as an EMT and his construction background gave him unique insights his classmates lacked. His mother's strength during her treatment inspired him daily. Watching the oncology nurses and doctors at work gave him an even deeper appreciation for medical professionals. During long nights of study, when the material seemed overwhelming, he'd remember the feel of the burning car's heat on his skin, the weight of Officer Park in his arms, and he'd find the strength to keep going. The Seattle Fire Department, hearing about his background, invited him to speak to their rookie class about his experience. Standing before them, Mike shared not just the story of the rescue, but the journey it had sparked. "Sometimes the biggest emergencies in life aren't the ones with sirens and flames," he told them. "Sometimes they're the quiet moments when we have to decide who we really want to be." His story caught the attention of a local news station, and soon he was featured in a segment about second-career medical professionals. The piece went viral, just like the original rescue video, but this time for a different reason. It wasn't just about a dramatic rescue anymore, it was about the ripple effects of one brave decision. Back in his hometown, the Parks kept him updated on local news. The scholarship program Dr. Wong had started had its first class of students. Officer Park had been promoted and was now teaching at the police academy, where he used Mike's story to illustrate the importance of community connections in law enforcement. One evening, after a particularly challenging day of training, Mike received a video call from Jenny. She was excited to share her school project, a presentation about everyday heroes. She'd chosen to talk about Mike, not just for saving her dad, but for showing her that it's never too late to follow your dreams. As Mike sat in his apartment that night, surrounded by medical textbooks and notes, he reflected on how far he'd come from that foggy morning on Route 27. His mother's cancer treatments were showing positive results, his paramedic training was progressing well, and though he was miles from where his journey had started, he felt closer than ever to who he was meant to be. What he didn't know was that the biggest test of his new skills and courage was just around the corner, one that would bring his journey full circle in ways he never could have imagined. 6 months into his Seattle journey, Mike's life had found a new rhythm. His mother's treatments were showing promising results, and his paramedic training was entering its most intensive phase. The long hours of study and practical training were paying off. He was consistently at the top of his class, earning praise from instructors who appreciated his unique perspective and calm demeanor under pressure. But it was during a routine training shift that life threw him another curveball. The call came in just before dawn, a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. As Mike rode in the ambulance with his training supervisor, the details coming over the radio were eerily familiar: a police cruiser involved, possible fire, trapped officer. The morning fog rolling off Puget Sound reminded him of that day on Route 27. His heart raced, but this time it was different. He wasn't just a construction worker acting on instinct, he was a trained medical professional with knowledge and skills he'd spent months honing. Arriving at the scene, Mike's training kicked in automatically. The police cruiser was on its side, pinned between a guardrail and a jackknifed truck. Smoke was rising from the engine compartment, but there was no fire yet. The officer was conscious but trapped, calling for help through his partially open window. "Chen, take lead on patient assessment," his supervisor ordered, recognizing that this was a moment Mike had been preparing for without realizing it. As fire crews worked to stabilize the vehicles, Mike made his way to the cruiser, speaking calmly to the trapped officer. "I'm Mike, I'm a paramedic trainee. I've been in your position before, well, sort of," he said, establishing the connection that had become his trademark. "We're going to get you out of here, but first I need to check a few things." The officer, a young woman named Grace Thompson, managed a smile despite her pain. "I've heard about you," she said through gritted teeth. "You're the construction worker who became a paramedic after saving that cop in, where was it?" "Pine Grove," Mike answered, checking her vitals while maintaining conversation. "But right now, let's focus on getting you safely out of here." The next 30 minutes were intense. Mike worked seamlessly with the fire crew, applying his medical training while his construction experience helped him understand the technical aspects of the extraction. When they finally freed Officer Thompson, Mike's calm reassurance and skilled care had kept her stable throughout the ordeal. Later that night, after his shift ended, Mike sat in the hospital cafeteria with his supervisor. "You know what impressed me most?" the veteran paramedic said. "Not the technical skills, though those were spot on. It was how you connected with her. That's something that can't be taught." The incident made the local news, and soon the story spread. The hero from one police rescue had done it again, this time as a trained professional. When Officer Park called from Pine Grove, Mike could hear the pride in his friend's voice. "Some things come full circle," David said. "But this time you knew exactly what you were doing." The rescue brought unexpected attention to the hospital's second career medical training program. Dr. Wong flew up from Pine Grove to appear with Mike on a Seattle morning news show, discussing the importance of life experience in emergency medical services. Applications to the program doubled after their appearance. But the most significant impact came from Officer Thompson herself. During her recovery, she learned more about Mike's story and was inspired to start a mentorship program connecting first responders with people interested in changing careers to emergency services. "Sometimes we need someone who's walked the path to show us it's possible," she told Mike when he visited her in the hospital. "You did that twice now, first by example, and then by literally saving my life." Mike's mother, now strong enough to attend his training graduation ceremony, watched with tears in her eyes as he received his paramedic certification. "I always worried about you working construction," she admitted later. "Not because it wasn't good work, but because I could see it didn't light you up inside. Now, when you talk about your work, you shine." The ceremony was made even more special by surprise guests. The entire Park family had flown up from Pine Grove. Jenny and Tommy, both noticeably taller, ran to hug him. Officer Park, now Lieutenant Park, beamed with pride as if Mike were his own brother graduating. During the celebration dinner, Annie Park shared news from home. The scholarship program had expanded to 3 other hospitals in neighboring cities. Mike's original rescue video was being used in police academy training sessions across the country. The ripple effects of that foggy morning continued to spread. But it was Tommy who asked the question everyone was wondering: "Are you coming back home now, Uncle Mike?" Mike looked around the table at the faces of both his families, his mother, the Parks, his new colleagues from Seattle. The question wasn't just about geography, it was about where his journey would lead next. "Home is wherever we can make a difference," he said finally. And sometimes that means being ready to go where we're needed most. He didn't know it then, but those words would prove prophetic. As he settled into his new role as a full-fledged paramedic, splitting his time between Seattle and Pine Grove, Mike was about to face his biggest challenge yet. A crisis was coming that would require everything he'd learned in both his old life and his new one, and would test not just his medical skills, but his courage in ways he never expected. The fog was rolling in again off Puget Sound, but this time Mike wasn't afraid of what it might bring. He had learned that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the best changes, if you were brave enough to answer the call. The crisis came on an ordinary Tuesday, exactly 18 months after Mike had pulled Officer Park from the burning cruiser. He was working a shift in Pine Grove, having arranged his schedule to split time between both cities, when the emergency alert system blared to life across the county. A massive pileup on the interstate had shut down all lanes in both directions. Early reports suggested at least 15 vehicles were involved, including a fuel truck. As Mike's ambulance raced toward the scene, the dispatcher's voice remained steady, but the gravity of the situation was clear. This was the kind of incident that would test every emergency responder's training and courage. Approaching the scene, Mike saw the scale of the disaster. The fog that had become such a significant part of his story had rolled in again, but this time it was mixed with smoke from multiple vehicle fires. The fuel truck had jackknifed across the median, its tank compromised but not yet ignited. "Chen, take command of the medical response," his supervisor ordered, recognizing Mike's unique combination of experiences. "You've got construction knowledge, rescue experience, and medical training. Use it all." In that moment, everything in Mike's journey came together. His construction background helped him quickly assess structural risks around the damaged vehicles. His rescue experience guided his prioritization of victims. His medical training gave him the skills to save lives. He organized the responding medical teams into zones, directing resources where they were needed most. When he heard that several victims were trapped in their vehicles, he worked alongside firefighters, sharing insights from his construction days about the safest approach to extraction. One rescue particularly tested him. A young mother was trapped in her car with her infant daughter, the vehicle precariously balanced on the edge of an overpass. The baby was safely removed, but the mother remained pinned by the crushed dashboard. As smoke began rising from the engine, Mike made the call to enter the vehicle himself. "I'm Mike," he said, making eye contact with the terrified woman. "I know exactly how you're feeling right now. I've been on both sides of a rescue like this. We're going to get you out." Using techniques he'd learned from his own experience with Officer Park's rescue, combined with his professional training, Mike worked methodically to free the woman. When she was finally extracted moments before her car caught fire, she gripped his hand. "Thank you for not giving up," she whispered. The crisis lasted for hours, but Mike never faltered. His calm leadership and quick decision-making helped save numerous lives that day. As the sun set and the last victim was transported to the hospital, his supervisor pulled him aside. "You know what happened today?" the older paramedic asked. "You showed everyone why second chances and career changes matter. Your whole journey prepared you for this moment." The incident made national news, but this time Mike wasn't uncomfortable with the attention. He used the platform to speak about the importance of emergency preparedness and the value of life experience in emergency services. The video of him organizing the rescue operation went viral, joining his original rescue video in training programs across the country. Back in Seattle, Officer Thompson had fully recovered and was actively running the mentorship program she'd started. When she saw the news about Mike's handling of the pileup, she immediately reached out to him with a proposal. "We need you to help develop a training program," she explained during a video call. "Something that combines technical skills with real-life experience. Your story, from construction worker to hero to professional rescuer, it's more than just inspiring. It's a blueprint for others." The idea resonated with Mike. He thought about all the people who had helped him along his journey: Dr. Wong, the Park family, his instructors, his mother who was now cancer-free. Each had contributed to his transformation, and now he had the chance to help others find their path. During his next visit to Pine Grove, he had dinner with the Parks, as was their tradition. Lieutenant Park shared how the police department had changed its training protocols based on lessons learned from both of Mike's major rescues. Jenny, now in middle school, announced she wanted to become an emergency room doctor. "You know what's amazing?" Annie said, serving dessert. "That morning when you saved David, it wasn't just one rescue. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that's still going on." The truth of her words struck Mike deeply. Every life he'd saved or helped since that morning was connected to his decision to stop and help a stranger in need. Every person inspired by his story to pursue emergency services would go on to help others, creating an endless ripple effect of positive change. Later that evening, as Mike drove past the spot on Route 27 where his journey had begun, he noticed something new. The city had installed a small memorial plaque commemorating the rescue that had sparked so much change. But more importantly, they'd also installed better lighting and emergency call boxes along that stretch of road, practical changes that could help save more lives. What had started as one man's instinctive act of courage had grown into something far bigger than himself. Mike's story had become a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of following your true calling, and the incredible impact that one person's brave decision could have on countless lives. But even as he reflected on how far he'd come, Mike knew his journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more lives to save, more people to inspire. The fog would roll in again, bringing with it new tests of courage and skill. But now he understood that each challenge was just another opportunity to make a difference. The final chapter of his story was yet to be written, but one thing was certain: the ripple effects of that fateful morning would continue to spread, touching lives in ways that even Mike couldn't imagine. 5 years had passed since that foggy morning on Route 27, and Mike Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the National Emergency Services Conference. The journey that began with a split-second decision to help a stranger had led him here, where he would share the lessons learned from his remarkable path from construction worker to celebrated paramedic. But before taking the stage, Mike's mind wandered to all the moments that had brought him to this point. His mother, now 5 years cancer-free, sat in the front row beside the Park family. Lieutenant Park, recently promoted to captain, had flown in with Annie and their kids. Jenny was now applying to pre-med programs, inspired by the path she'd watched Mike take. Officer Thompson had come from Seattle, where she now ran one of the country's most successful first responder mentorship programs. Dr. Wong, though retired, had made the trip to see the fruition of the second career medical program he'd championed. Even Mike's old construction foreman was there, representing the many people who'd supported his transformation. As Mike began his keynote speech, he didn't start with the dramatic rescue that had changed his life. Instead, he pulled out his old construction hard hat, setting it beside his paramedic badge on the podium. "Every tool teaches us something," he began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true calling. "This hard hat taught me about safety, teamwork, and the importance of building strong foundations. Those lessons didn't end when I changed careers, they became the building blocks of my new life." He shared how his construction experience had repeatedly proved valuable in emergency situations, from understanding structural risks during rescues to knowing how to communicate effectively with diverse teams. The skills he'd thought he was leaving behind had become an unexpected asset in his new career. Mike spoke about the many lives that had intersected with his own. He told them about Tommy Park, now a high school senior, who had started a first responder club at his school. About the young mother from the interstate pileup, who had gone on to become an emergency dispatcher, wanting to be part of the system that had saved her life. But it was when he talked about the ripple effects of courage that the audience leaned in closest. "We often think of bravery as those big, dramatic moments," he said, glancing at Captain Park. Running toward danger, saving lives, making split-second decisions. But sometimes the greatest courage is in what comes after, the decision to change, to grow, to become more than we thought possible. The training program he had helped develop with Officer Thompson had spread to departments across the country. It specifically sought out people with diverse work backgrounds, recognizing that life experience brought valuable perspectives to emergency services. Construction workers, teachers, office managers, people from all walks of life were finding their way to meaningful second careers as first responders. Every emergency is different, Mike continued, but they all share one thing in common: they're about people. People in their worst moments, needing someone who can not only provide medical care but also understand what they're going through. Sometimes that understanding comes from unusual places, like a construction site, or a classroom, or an office. He shared stories from his dual life working in both Seattle and Pine Grove, how each city had taught him different lessons about community and care. The memorial on Route 27 had become a symbol of hope, not just commemorating one rescue, but celebrating the potential for positive change that existed in every person. As he concluded his speech, Mike revealed the next chapter in his journey. He was helping to establish a national foundation that would provide scholarships and support for people seeking to enter emergency services as a second career. The foundation would be named after Captain Park, honoring not just the rescue that started it all, but the friendship and family bonds that had grown from it. 5 years ago, I pulled a stranger from a burning car, Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. Today, that stranger's daughter is heading to medical school. His son is inspiring his classmates to serve their community. And I'm standing here, a different person than I was that morning, but carrying with me every lesson, every relationship, and every experience that brought me to this moment. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Mike, it was for every person who had ever dreamed of making a change but feared it was too late. It was for every first responder who had ever gone above and beyond the call of duty. It was for every act of courage, big or small, that had the power to transform lives. After the conference, at a small gathering of family and friends, Jenny Park presented Mike with a gift, a shadow box containing his old construction gloves, his first EMT badge, and a piece of the burnt police cruiser from Route 27. Below it was a simple inscription: "Some heroes are born in a moment, but they're made by every moment after." As Mike looked around the room at the faces of those who had become his extended family, he realized that his story wasn't just about one man's journey from construction worker to paramedic. It was about the interconnected web of lives that could be touched by a single act of courage, the endless possibilities that opened up when someone dared to change their life's direction, and the profound impact that ordinary people could have when they chose to be extraordinary. The fog still rolled in sometimes on Route 27, and emergency vehicles still raced through the streets of both Pine Grove and Seattle. But now, among those responding to calls for help were dozens of people who had been inspired by Mike's story to make their own brave changes. Each of them carried with them the understanding that every emergency, every rescue, every moment of crisis was an opportunity not just to save a life, but to change lives, including their own. And somewhere out there, on any given morning, another person might be facing their own moment of decision, their own burning car, their own chance to step forward and say, "I can help." Mike's story had become a beacon for those moments, a reminder that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, and that the bravest decision isn't always the first one, sometimes it's all the decisions that follow.